Hello again, I'm Martyn Heyne, and today I would like to make some observations about what drives developments in music culture. As in, why does a type of music or artist cease to be popular, and why are they being replaced by something new? The conventional wisdom of music writers seems to often assume that this development is a linear progression towards improvement, driven by listener preference and artists' advancing discoveries. This does not only strike me as completely false in musical terms, which is a subject for another day, but also culturally I believe there are more convincing explanations. We as musically inclined people, fans and artists, don't contextualize the current situation sufficiently, and as a result, there is much bewilderment at recent developments. It's great to try and make sense of things, so I will try and share some thoughts today on what might play a significant role in driving these developments in music culture, and hopefully you will chime in with your thoughts as well. The idea for today's episode was sparked by the TV appearance of Richard Osman that the algorithm decided to play at me via various social media channels. In this appearance, Richard notes that in the first half of the 80s, something like 150 weeks of UK #1 record sales spots were occupied by bands. In the first half of the 90s, the number was only slightly lower. He then skips the noughts and tens and notes that in the first half of the 20s, the number is only 3, one of which is an all-star band, one is the Beatles, and the last one is some sort of TV casting show ensemble. So he concludes that bands are dead. They've somehow miraculously perished overnight. Do people not like them anymore? Have attention spans shortened too much to sustain the ability to write a song? I don't think so. In this double episode, I want to create an arch across the musical development from the past 300 years until today. I will offer a reason for the disappearance of bands based on this, and make a forecast for my personal amusement because I'm convinced of the utter inability of humans to make any meaningful predictions. Also, nowadays when people think of music culture, they may think of recordings rather than an in-person experience. Yet in this video I will focus on concerts, live events, shows, for two reasons. Firstly, recordings didn't exist for much of the history I will cover. Secondly, while recordings were financially more relevant than shows for a brief moment in this history, the shows were always the basis on which a new artist was established. Even in the heyday of record sales, you had to break an artist via touring first. Let's quickly consider what, in essence, a show is. You might think of clubs and concert halls, tour buses, posters and massive light rigs. But these things are just the infrastructure into which you can drop a show. A show itself really is only two things, a name and the show itself. The purpose of the name is solely to sell the tickets and for people to actually show up. If the name cannot do that, anything downstream is irrelevant. The modern focus on the conductor in classical music, for example, has much to do with the significance of the name. Also, the power of the name can be very different for a band or just its lead singer with other musicians, even though the music can in some cases be fairly similar. Do you think it'd be easier to sell tickets for a show by Talk Talk or Mark Hollis? Or the other way around, a show by Tin Machine or David Bowie? As for number 2, the purpose of the show itself is to satisfy the audience, convince them that it was actually worth their time and money going. A show that sells tickets but does not fulfill the second criteria is dead within a year. If the two criteria are met, the show will grow each time it comes back to a city, and that's how careers grow. Of course, you start out with a bit of a catch-22. The show is what creates the name, so the beginning is tricky. But however humble the beginnings, if the show is there, over time it will grow. And so the experience of listening to and seeing the music performed is, unsurprisingly, rather important. Anyways, with this in mind, in this episode I'm going to cover the first 2 centuries and then the remaining one hopefully next week. I'm sorry I keep splitting things up, but I have to keep an eye on the time a little. Let's start in the year 1700, because it's a round number and Johann Sebastian Bach is at that time a young student in Lüneburg, northern Germany. Of course, there is tons of music history before him, but I would say with his works, the whole thing is really in full swing, and a long list of compositions of his have endured as some of the best known and loved repertoire until today. This includes many defining works for a list of instruments, including the uber-famous keyboard works, violin sonatas, cello suites, lute suites, flute, and so forth. But the king instrument during his time was the organ. Playing and composing for the organ was really the essence of his job at the various stations in his life. He was also a real expert on the technical side of the instrument and was sometimes called upon to examine and assess organs. His engagements in new positions would often include costly overhauls or extensions of the existing organs that he played. And he also designed and provided detailed specifications for a very advanced new build for his job in Mühlhausen in 1708. Now, why was the organ so pivotal? Picture yourself in 1700 in Germany. You've not got an iPhone. In fact, anything you ever see is in front of your eyes. If you like music, you better start singing. After sunset, there's only candlelight. Traveling is on foot. You get the picture. Now you step inside a church. The building itself is pretty much the biggest thing you've ever seen in your life. The sun floods through the stained glass windows, spilling endless colors onto the floor. And in the most glorious reverberance known to man, you hear this massive, harmonious sound. Of course, today we get hung up on the fact that nobody could really improve on the material that Bach wrote. But in the situation that I've just described, even the most basic playing would have been sufficient to lift you out of your earthly shoes and straight into the arms of the Creator, and frequently did. I want to specifically emphasize that the sound was loud and had low end. These organs were massive music machines, the power of which was then trapped inside the acoustics of the church so that layer upon layer could build structures of enormity that humans simply had not experienced in any other context. The bass of a great organ can go so low that you can easily think there's an earthquake. What else could humans have encountered at that time that would have such a bass? Nothing, I think. And consider what our natural associations with pitch and size are. Small being high-pitched sound? The lower the sound, the bigger the source. A lion's roar is reduced to a bit of a mosquito compared to an organ pipe that you feel shaking more than you can hear it. Loud with low end was an experience. Loud with low end was truly a show. Now, we should keep in mind one considerable disadvantage with this whole setup. It was incredibly costly to build the organ and the church around it, and both of these things would then be entirely immobile. Let's get back to Bach. He wrote tons of material for solo instruments, but also for a number of ensembles of growing sizes as the situation permitted. A larger number of players really meant a larger number of sound colors available, and a larger sound in general. During his time in Köthen, he wrote the Brandenburg concertos for an instrumentation that is basically a small forerunner of an orchestra, mixing strings, woodwinds, brass and harpsichord. During his final position in Leipzig, so until 1750, he escalated the instrumentations further. The St. John Passion has a larger orchestra with strings, woodwinds, lute, organ, double bass and a full choir plus soloists. Then for the St. Matthew Passion he used 2 orchestras and 2 choirs, because, in the immortal words of Yngwie Malmsteen, more is more. Another piece with a similarly large orchestration from that time is the legendary B minor Mass. That one's also got timpani and trumpets. It's just epic. Again, any sane person looking at this work would be entirely right to point out the musical complexity and the depth of this piece. Yet, for the sake of today's topic, let's bear in mind the mundane fact that Bach's instrumentations grew. Furthermore, these new quasi-orchestral works could now be performed at a king's court, for example, or in the storage halls of cloth merchants. Deriving the musical force from numbers of performers rather than a large music machine meant a significant increase in mobility. It's now an army instead of a fortress. The trend continued, Haydn's later symphonies in the 1790s already had a solid orchestra from a modern perspective. Full strings with first and second violins, violas, cellos and basses, then flutes, clarinets, oboes and bassoons, then horns and trumpets, sometimes timpani and other additional percussion. About 40 musicians was not uncommon. Sometimes it could even be up to 60. So without the choir it looks like less than the late Bach, but the orchestra itself actually grew. If you add the choir back in, like in 1824 in Beethoven's Ninth, for example, where he also had trombones, four horns, piccolo, bass drum and other percussion, you can easily have over 150 performers on the stage, depending a lot on the size of the choir, obviously. Yet, this was all in need of improvement to Wagner, who wanted more strings for a richer sound. Where Mozart would have used 6 to 8 first violins, Wagner was more along the lines of 16. He also used a lot more brass, up to 8 horns. He added the Wagner tuba, an instrument meant to bridge the gap between the horns and the trombones. He also added odd and purpose-built instruments like the thunder machine or, and this is really true, 18 tuned anvils to be played with hammers in Das Rheingold. Anyways, towards the later 19th century, he died in 1883, Wagner also noticeably improved on the low end. He used the bass clarinet, contrabassoon, tuba, and of course more double basses. So you see how you can now easily end up with 100 players inside the orchestra pit, singers not included. And it's not only in terms of instrumentation that Wagner featured the low end, but also in terms of composition. He really put them to work. Again, next to the overwhelming musical brilliance, there is a clear development towards loud with low end. One other work I'd like to mention in the context of this musical arms race is Stravinsky's early 20th century piece The Rite of Spring. Seeing this one in concert is really a thrill because the stage is absolutely packed with players and musical colours are just being tossed at you from every possible direction. You know, when I was a child I had a little Casio keyboard and it had 99 different sounds. And then it had a little button named Demo, and when you pressed that it would play a version of Wake Me Up Before You Go Go using all the 99 different sounds. Now please don't take this the wrong way, but in the best possible sense, The Rite of Spring is kind of like such a demo button for an orchestra. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks very much for listening. Next week we'll cover the remaining 100 years and come to a conclusion. For the time being, if you have additional questions or your own thoughts to share, please do so in the comments. Also feel free to send this video to your music friends and follow me here if you wish to be notified about future episodes. Thanks very much. Goodbye.